Let's imagine that you wake up tomorrow with a personal fortune not in the millions, not even in the billions, but in the tens of billions. Furthermore, like so many of us would like to think we would do, you decide to place a massive amount of your wealth into what you consider to be admirable causes. A democratic election here, a criminal justice reform there, and yet you soon find that half of America despises you. Foreign governments pass emergency laws with your name on them. The prosecutors you funded to reduce incarceration instead preside over murder rates that double within years. In fact, even your home country plasters your face on billboards as a national enemy. Indeed, this is the shocking life trajectory of none other than George Soros, a man whose journey from Holocaust survivor to legendary financial trader to global bogeyman might be the most important lesson we've ever covered on how good intentions, unlimited resources, and unchecked power create a uniquely modern kind of hated billionaire. Thus, in today's episode of Old Money Luxury, we share the full saga of, arguably, the most polarizing billionaire family of the 21st century, and let you decide whether they're misunderstood philanthropists or dangerous puppet masters of democracy. Nearly half of American voters believe George Soros wants to erode the very fabric of civilization, while the same percentage agrees with an even darker assessment that he hates humanity itself. And these aren't the rantings of fringe conspiracy theorists. They're findings from mainstream Rasmussen polling that reveal something extraordinary about public sentiment. You see, when only 24% of Americans view you favorably and 51% actively despise you, you've achieved a special kind of infamy that transcends normal political divisions. Indeed, YouGov's data confirms this pattern with similarly dismal numbers, showing only 28% popularity against waves of public revulsion that cross all demographic lines. But what drives this visceral hatred toward a Hungarian-born financier who claims to promote democracy and human rights? The answer becomes clear when, for example, you examine how Soros has systematically injected over $117 million into local prosecutor races across America, installing 75 district attorneys who dance to his tune. These aren't random positions, but carefully selected jurisdictions that give him control over the fate of 70 million Americans, 1 in 5 citizens living under the shadow of Soros-funded justice. Even more disturbing, cities under these prosecutors' control account for 40% of all U.S. homicides and 40% of America's total criminal activity, creating corridors of chaos in major population centers. Philadelphia offers the starkest example of this experiment's deadly consequences, where the Soros-funded prosecutor oversaw an 87% explosion in murders, while gun crime convictions simultaneously collapsed from 64% to just 35%. Prison populations plummeted by over 3,000 as violent criminals walked free, including one released felon who murdered a police officer the very same day he gained his freedom. This pattern of carnage repeats itself in Los Angeles, Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco, painting a picture of systematic destruction of public safety. Foreign governments recognized this threat long before American voters fully grasped its implications, with Hungary, Soros's own original homeland, passing emergency legislation specifically targeting Soros-funded organizations and making it illegal for NGOs to assist the activities he promoted. From Pakistan shutting down all Soros operations to India placing his foundations on watch lists, nations across different continents and ideologies have reached identical conclusions about the danger he represents. Meanwhile, his media manipulation runs even deeper than his prosecutor purchases, with $131 million flowing to 253 media organizations worldwide. Major newspapers, television networks, and online platforms receive Soros money, while 54 prominent journalists maintain direct connections to his funding network, ensuring favorable coverage and suppressing criticism. And yet, how did a Holocaust survivor who fled tyranny somehow transform into one of the world's most feared private citizens? To get our answer, we'll have to flip over to the next chapter. Gyorgy Schwartz was 14 when the Nazis occupied Budapest, transforming his childhood into a daily fight for survival in a city where being Jewish meant death. His father secured forged Christian identity papers from the underground resistance, giving the family a fragile shield against the systematic murder consuming 500,000 Hungarian Jews. Each day brought terror as Nazi patrols scrutinized documents and questioned anyone who aroused suspicion, while neighbors disappeared into the machinery of genocide that had engulfed Europe. Young Gyorgy witnessed families he knew being marched to collection points for deportation, understanding that only a thin piece of forged paper separated him from the cattle cars headed to Auschwitz. The trauma of hiding his true identity while death surrounded him would leave permanent scars on his psyche, shaping a worldview where survival justified any means necessary. This experience taught him that reality itself was malleable, that authorities could be fooled, systems circumvented, and that those who controlled perception controlled fate itself. When Soviet tanks replaced Nazi boots in Budapest streets, Gyorgy recognized that one totalitarian nightmare had simply given way to another, and at 17, he made the decision that would define his life: escape to the West. He arrived in London in 1947, carrying nothing but trauma and ambition, finding work washing dishes in Piccadilly nightclubs where British aristocrats wasted fortunes on champagne and jazz. During the day, he hauled suitcases at railway stations, observing how the wealthy travelled in first-class carriages while refugees like him struggled for scraps, each menial job teaching him about the vast gulf between those with power and those without. The London School of Economics accepted this penniless refugee despite his broken English, opening doors to a world of ideas that would transform his understanding of society and markets. There he encountered philosopher Karl Popper's concept of the open society, though young Soros would interpret these idealistic notions through the lens of someone who had seen civilization collapse into barbarism. He legally changed his name from Schwartz to Soros, choosing the Hungarian word for successor, in a gesture that revealed his determination to transcend his refugee status. Singer and Friedlander Bank hired him in their arbitrage department in 1953, where he discovered his calling in exploiting price differences between markets, finding profit in the gaps between perception and reality. By 1956, Soros had saved enough to sail for New York, where F.M. Meyer hired him to analyze European stocks for American investors hungry for opportunities across the Atlantic. His climb up Wall Street's ladder continued at Wertheim and Company, each position teaching him more about how financial markets operated on psychology rather than pure mathematics. In 1969, he launched the Double Eagle Fund with money scraped together from years of careful saving, renaming it the Quantum Fund in 1973, after the physics principle that uncertainty was fundamental to reality. His reflexivity theory claimed that market participants don't just respond to reality, but actively create it through their biased perceptions, a philosophy that academic economists dismissed as pretentious nonsense. They didn't understand that Soros had survived the collapse of one reality and witnessed its replacement by another, giving him unique insight into how fragile all systems truly were. In 1992, he spotted Britain making the same fatal mistake as those who believed their own propaganda, thinking that political will could override economic reality. September 16, 1992, began with the Bank of England confident in its power, but by sunset, George Soros had humiliated the British Empire and pocketed $1 billion in what history would remember as Black Wednesday. The stage for this financial earthquake had been set months earlier when Soros began studying the pound sterling's precarious position within the European exchange rate mechanism, a system that required Britain to maintain its currency above 2.7 German marks, regardless of economic reality. With inflation raging and the economy weakening, this promise defied mathematical logic, yet British politicians clung to it with the stubborn pride that had once built an empire and now threatened to bankrupt one. Soros recognized what the entire British establishment refused to admit. Their currency was a dead man walking, propped up by nothing more than political vanity and taxpayer money that would soon run out. While other investors hesitated, Soros began building a position so massive that colleagues questioned his sanity, accumulating a $10 billion bet against sterling through leveraged funds that would either crown him king or destroy him completely. The Bank of England detected the mounting pressure as waves of selling crashed against the pound, responding with the only tools central bankers know: arrogance, denial, and other people's money thrown desperately at the problem. Interest rates rocketed from 10% to 12%, then to an unprecedented 15% in panicked hours, as officials tried to make holding pounds attractive enough to stem the bleeding. Behind the facade of calm, the bank hemorrhaged billions buying its own currency in a doomed attempt to maintain the fiction that political promises could overcome market mathematics. Norman Lamont, Britain's Chancellor, appeared on television throughout the day, promising to defend sterling at any cost, apparently unaware that Soros and other speculators were more than happy to name that price. The Quantum Fund led the assault, but soon every major trading desk in the world smelled blood in the water, joining what became a feeding frenzy against the wounded pound. Soros kept selling with the methodical precision of a surgeon, knowing that every basis point the pound dropped meant another $100 million in profit for his fund. By early evening, with reserves exhausted and credibility shattered, the British government faced a choice between complete economic collapse and humiliating surrender to the markets. At 7:30 that evening, an ashen-faced Lamont emerged from number 11 Downing Street to announce what the markets already knew. Britain would withdraw from the European exchange rate mechanism and allow the pound to find its own level. Sterling immediately crashed through the floor it had desperately defended all day, vindicating Soros's conviction that artificial currency pegs were nothing more than invitations to speculators with enough capital and courage. The final tally stunned even financial professionals. Soros had earned approximately $1 billion in a single day, while the British Treasury lost £3.4 billion of taxpayer money in their futile defence. Newspapers around the world crowned him the man who broke the Bank of England, a title that captured both the audacity of his trade and the humiliation of a former superpower brought to its knees by a single speculator. The victory transcended mere profit, demonstrating that in the new world of global finance, a determined individual with sufficient resources could force even sovereign governments to capitulate. More importantly for Soros, the triumph validated his reflexivity theory in the most dramatic way possible. He had created the reality he traded by forcing others to recognize what he saw first. The quantum physics student had proven that markets weren't rational, efficient mechanisms, but playgrounds where perception could be weaponized by those with enough conviction and capital. Central banks, governments, even the mighty British Empire, all could be broken by someone who understood that confidence was just another currency that could be shorted. American prosecutors were about to learn they could be purchased even more cheaply than British pounds. Larry Krasner needed $1.7 million to become Philadelphia's district attorney, and George Soros wrote the check without hesitation, purchasing control over justice in America's sixth largest city with the casual ease of buying a yacht. The money represented over 30% of all spending in the 7-candidate primary, working out to roughly $33 per vote in Krasner's victory, a bargain for reshaping an entire city's justice system. What followed in Philadelphia became Soros's most catastrophic experiment, as murders exploded from 315 to 562 by 2021, nearly doubling under Krasner's watch. Gun crime convictions collapsed from 64% to just 35%, while the percentage of cases Krasner simply dismissed skyrocketed to 61%, creating a paradise for violent criminals. The human cost crystallized in Hassan Elliott's case. Krasner released this repeat offender despite felony gun possession and cocaine dealing charges. And that same day, Elliott murdered a man before later executing Police Corporal James O'Connor. In Virginia, Soros spent over $2 million in 2019 installing 4 prosecutors, with Buta Biberaj receiving nearly $850,000 and Steve Descano getting $600,000. Descano's Fairfax County became a case study in prosecutorial sabotage, filing 49% fewer felony cases than his predecessor, while dismissals and dropped charges surged 51%. Under Descano's leadership, all crime increased 15%, aggravated assault jumped 43%, and carjacking exploded 74%, transforming one of Virginia's safest counties into a criminal playground. Shoplifting surged 40% after Descano announced his office wouldn't prosecute thefts under $1,000, essentially legalizing stealing for anyone smart enough to keep receipts. Descano even downgraded abduction and burglary charges that could have imprisoned a defendant for 26 years. The freed man later allegedly killed 2 homeless men and wounded 3 others during a 9-day shooting spree. Meanwhile, in Loudoun County, Biberaj faced judicial sanctions when Judge James Plowman removed her entire office from multiple cases for deliberately misleading the court and the public. Her incompetence led to 2 murder suspects being released within weeks of each other due to basic procedural errors, with one case dismissed entirely while the other required a manhunt in Georgia. Chicago's Kim Foxx presided over 4,000 murders during her 6-year tenure, averaging 666 annually, 165 more per year than before she took office. The average felony approval rate under Foxx dropped from 83 to 73%, while rejection rates nearly doubled, meaning thousands fewer prosecutions annually in America's 3rd largest city. Baltimore's Marilyn Mosby achieved even worse results, with the murder rate climbing past 300 annually and hitting 348 in 2019, a rate of 59 per 100,000 residents. Only 53% of felony cases resulted in conviction under Mosby, compared to 67% before she took office, while she permanently stopped prosecuting drug possession, prostitution, and trespassing. St. Louis became a prosecution graveyard under Kim Gardner, with no prosecution rates more than doubling from 13% to nearly 36%, while total felony cases processed collapsed from 4,700 to just 861. After Gardner's forced resignation, her replacement filed 1,400 cases in 3 months, more than double the 620 Gardner had managed during the same period the previous year. Austin's Jose Garza rejected 142 felony cases in just 4 months, using his early case review policy, compared to only 17 rejections during the same period under his predecessor, a 735% increase. Boston's Rachel Rollins pledged to stop prosecuting 15 categories of offenses, but court observers found she continued prosecuting many cases on her do not charge list, revealing even Soros. Prosecutors couldn't fully abandon their duties. Alex Soros watched these failures and decided his father's problem was thinking too small. George Soros shocked his inner circle in June 2023 with an announcement that contradicted everything he'd previously said about succession. The 92-year-old billionaire was handing his $25 billion empire to his son, Alex. This same father had repeatedly declared he didn't want any of his children taking over the foundation, believing the mission too important to become a family dynasty, yet something had changed his mind dramatically. That something was Alex's chilling promise to be more political than his father, a pledge that sent shivers through those who already considered George Soros dangerously influential in American democracy. At 37, Alex Soros radiated an intensity that unsettled even hardened political operatives, displaying none of his father's preference for operating from the shadows, but instead craving spotlight and presidential selfies. His Instagram became a trophy case of political influence, featuring grins with Biden, Zelensky, and virtually every Democrat who mattered, while his White House visitor logs showed 20 appearances during the Biden administration, more than most cabinet members could claim. The promise to be more political wasn't empty rhetoric, but a threat Alex began executing immediately, with Democracy PAC spending exploding to $40 million under his control, while his personal donations dwarfed his father's contributions. Where George had invested $4 million in prosecutor races during 2020 to reshape criminal justice, Alex slashed that to a mere $131,000 in 2024, revealing his complete abandonment of his father's signature cause. He redirected $60 million from the Fund for Policy Reform straight into Democracy PAC for pure electoral politics, transforming a criminal justice nonprofit into a partisan war chest. His $10 million contribution to Future Forward PACs, supporting Democratic presidential efforts, was 10 times what his father had given during the same period in 2020, signaling an unprecedented escalation. Chuck Schumer transformed from a political acquaintance into Alex's good friend through constant cultivation and strategic donations, while Nancy Pelosi earned his public praise as the greatest Speaker of the House in American history. International leaders from Brazil's Lula to Canada's Trudeau welcomed his visits, recognizing that the Soros heir represented continuity of influence with an escalation of ambition that his father had never displayed so brazenly. The open society foundations that George had built over decades and funded with $32 billion of his personal fortune faced immediate upheaval under Alex's leadership. Despite historically promoting massive government programs worldwide, Alex announced plans to slash OSF's workforce by 40% in July 2023, citing his father's supposed concerns about bureaucracy. The cuts targeted international work while expanding domestic political operations, essentially converting a global charitable network into an arm of the Democratic Party infrastructure. A New York Magazine profile revealed the depth of dysfunction under Alex's leadership, with sources describing him as brooding and cerebral, with a propensity for candor and bursts of hot-temperedness. Internal sources were even blunter, calling him fucking impossible and not particularly interested in the details of actually running a complex global organization. One family insider stated the uncomfortable truth. Every single person who knows the family knows that Alex was exactly the wrong person to lead the foundation. Yet George handed this volatile son control over more money than most nations' annual budgets, trusting that raw political ambition could substitute for wisdom, experience, and strategic thinking. When the Democrats suffered devastating losses in 2024, despite over $100 million in Soros support for Harris-Walz's efforts, Alex deflected blame to unstoppable global forces. Rather than acknowledge that voters had rejected the policies his family funded, Alex attributed defeats to a global anti-incumbent trend, refusing to accept responsibility for the electoral disaster. Media Research Center's Joseph Vasquez captured what this transition meant, calling Alex actually more dangerous than his father due to his combination of youth, billions, and complete shamelessness about wielding political power. The Soros dynasty had spent decades building influence through indirect means, funding NGOs, prosecutors, and media organizations to shape society from the shadows. 20 White House visits were just the beginning. Entire governments were about to discover why the Soros name had become synonymous with existential threat. Vladimir Putin signed the order personally in November 2015, declaring open society foundations an enemy of the Russian state and warning that any citizen caught working with Soros faced 6 years in prison. The designation as an undesirable organization came with language that would have seemed hyperbolic if it weren't in an official government document. Soros represented a threat to the foundations of the constitutional system itself. Russia had fired the opening shot in what became a global governmental revolt against one billionaire family's influence, setting a precedent that would spread across continents as nations recognized a common threat. In Hungary, where Soros had spent millions promoting democracy after communism's fall, Viktor Orbán transformed him into a national boogeyman through the most expensive propaganda campaign in the country's history. Billboards across Budapest displayed Soros's smiling face with ominous warnings about his plan, while the tagline, "Don't let Soros have the last laugh," screamed from every street corner and subway station. The government spent millions convincing Hungarians that this son of Budapest wanted to Muslimize Europe through forced migration, tapping into primal fears about cultural extinction that resonated across the continent. Parliament passed emergency legislation literally titled the Stop Soros Package, making it illegal for NGOs to assist migrants in ways that Soros-funded organizations had pioneered, essentially criminalizing humanitarian work. The pressure became so intense that open society foundations fled Budapest for Berlin in 2018, marking the extraordinary moment when an organization built to promote Hungarian democracy was effectively exiled from Hungary itself. Pakistan ordered all Soros operations shut down in December 2017 without public explanation, while Belarus had earlier fined his foundations $3 million before expelling them completely. From Kazakhstan to Turkmenistan, governments banned his pro-democracy initiatives as subversive threats to national sovereignty, creating an unprecedented global consensus against a private citizen's influence operations. India placed open society on a government watch list, requiring pre-approval for every rupee of funding, effectively neutering the organization's ability to operate in the world's largest democracy. The pattern was unmistakable. Governments across different continents, ideologies and development levels had independently concluded that Soros organizations posed unacceptable threats to their sovereignty. These weren't authoritarian outliers, but a diverse collection of nations that recognized his foundations as something more dangerous than typical NGOs. They were parallel power structures challenging state authority. Meanwhile, American voters were reaching their own verdict on the Soros experiment in purchased justice, with 21 of his hand-picked prosecutors voted out of office since 2022. The backlash proved bipartisan in surprising places, with San Francisco liberals recalling Chesa Boudin by 60% and Los Angeles voters ousting George Gascon in landslides that shocked political observers. These elections represented more than typical political swings. They were desperate attempts by communities to reclaim their justice systems from an agenda that had turned their streets into war zones. The human cost of Soros's prosecutor experiment could be measured in bodies, with Philadelphia suffering 4,000 murders during Kim Foxx's tenure, while Baltimore endured 348 killings in a single year under Marilyn Mosby. St. Louis watched prosecution rates collapse so completely that criminals operated with near impunity, creating an urban hellscape where law-abiding citizens lived in fear while predators ruled the streets. Yet even as voters rejected his proxies and nations banned his organizations, Alex Soros was doubling down on his promise to be more political, with $25 billion at his disposal. The family that had transformed charitable giving into a weapon of political control wasn't retreating, but escalating, with Alex treating the White House like his personal clubhouse through his 20 documented visits. Foreign nations had written emergency laws specifically targeting one family's influence. American cities had become killing fields under prosecutors paid to not prosecute, and democracy itself groaned under the weight of purchased power. The concentration of influence in one family's hands had reached levels that made even sympathetic observers uncomfortable, proving that unchecked wealth could overwhelm democratic institutions designed for diffuse power. And now, we'd love to see you in the comments. What is your opinion of the Soros family? Is it an admirable, wealthy family promoting democracy around the world? Or is it a conspiratorial set of tyrants determined to bend people to their will? We can't wait to hear your thoughts, and be sure to play nice down there. With that said, we'll see you on the next one, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Old Money Luxury.